Norfolk Southern, what's your function?
Hooking up the country, helping business run.
Ah, yes, precision scheduled railroading. The business practice that puts our nation's railroads to hell. This business strategy was made to focus on aggressive cost cutting, which saw trains getting longer, maintenance being reduced, multiple layoffs, derailments, and facility closures. And for foamers, that would also see locomotive models being retired in masses. Norfolk Southern is amongst the victims of PSR, and probably the worst offender. And amongst its cost-cutting hellhole, it saw 700 locomotives being ejected from the roster. From yard switchers to mainline titans, we will find out what Norfolk Southern threw away at the start of this crappy decade, and what I affectionately call this situation as the Norfolk Southern Purge of 2020.
Norfolk Southern, what's your function? Hooking up the country, helping business run. Norfolk Southern has a function. Helping this big country move ahead as run.
Let's jump the clock back to 2015. Norfolk Southern's CEO at the time, Charles Moorman, would step down as CEO, giving the role to the late James A. Squires. Now, Squires had joined the company back in 1992 as he worked his way up to becoming president in 2013 before securing his role as a CEO. And this decision would kind of come with some consequences, considering that Squire would begin changing the operations of Norfolk Southern with the implementation of precision scheduled railroading. And one of these factors was his Top 21 plan, which planned to reduce operating expenses by 60%, alongside blending in different commodities onto fewer freight trains. Other factors included rail yards and repair facilities being closed, with one infamous example being the legacy Roanoke shops closing in 2020, optimization of rail networks with less trains, layoffs, and the biggest factor, at least to rail fans, was to purge its locomotive fleet by 40% in an attempt to reduce fuel consumption and cut operating costs. Yeah, this is where shit got heated. You see, Norfolk Southern's roster around 2015 was vast. Alongside your contemporary Dash 9s, Aces, Gevos, SC40s, and GP38s, you had niche locomotive models like Dash 8s, SC80 Max, SC60s of various cab designs, yard switchers, older SC70s, GP60s, etc. Not to mention unique or special equipment like the F units and Heritage units. And the Steam program, if anyone cares. Norfolk Southern was also in the midst of rebuilding its fleet of Dash 9s, SC60s, and eventually SC70s for continued use. So it looked like a pretty stacked roster, and Norfolk Southern did have long-term plans to standardize its roster through rebuilding. Now, the only retirements around that time were worn-out 4-axles, failed gensets, whatever these abominations were, and the standard cab Dash 8s. But by 2019, as a result of PSR, a majority of the road's DC power would be thrown into storage due to the reduced traffic levels that PSR brought with it. The first retirements would take place that same year, with the wipeout of the SC60s across wide, standard, isolated, and triclops variants, including the removal of the older F units, as Squires allegedly deemed them as a waste of money to run, which translated to CEO talk means, I need more money, I no need special choo-choo. However, if you thought that was already a sign of things to come, oh boy. Once 2020 hit, things got worse, as Norfolk Southern announced the plan to remove 500 locomotives from its roster, but the number increased to 703 to make its PSR-centric roster as more reliable, productive, and spend less time in the shops. And what were the casualties? Let's see, 16 slugs, 31 MP15Es, 28 Spartan Cab SC70s, 71 SC70Ms with both early and notch nose variants, including the 3 from the New York Susquehanna, 7 SE-75Ms from BNSF, 84 SE-70M-2s, 33 unrebuilt GP-59s, 29 SE-80 Max, 154 -840 CWs, including all 12 -8.5s, thank God, 66 SE-70 ACUs, and multiple GP-38-2s, GP-40-2s, and SE-40-2s, some of which were bought secondhand. That's quite a lot to dispose of, huh? It's fair to say that rail fans were divided on this decision, and it's pretty clear to see that plenty of foamers were outraged by this, while some tried to think logically and tell people to accept PSR and move on. Although, to be fair, none of us knew that PSR would lead to one of the most infamous disasters in recent years. But why would NS dispose of that many locomotives, you may say? For once, I'll try and set aside a foamer's bias and try to apply some sense or logic in this. Nonetheless, a few possible factors why Norfolk Southern retired en masse can include: Number 1. Operating costs. If there's one thing that shareholders love, it's profit. And with the amount of money needed to keep these locomotives maintained and operating, means little money for the shareholders. And that would never do. Okay, in all seriousness, my guess is that with the amount of locomotives Norfolk Southern rostered, the fuel, running, and repair costs would be rather high, especially with the variety of locomotives present on the roster. With Norfolk Southern reducing the amount of active locomotives, means that the railroad would save money on running them, which in theory sounds like a way to reduce the amount of fuel for locomotives, hence why many were stored and retired. This was especially prevalent with the reduced amount of trains needed with PSR, meaning less fuel consumption and saving on profits, meaning more money for greedy shareholders. Number 2. Age. You gotta consider that some of the locomotives retired were past the usual life expectancy of a locomotive, usually lasting 20 to 25 years in service at best. Unless you're like the EMDs. Models like the SE60s and -8s were past the usual lifespan and were pretty dated from a technology standpoint, albeit without rebuilds. Hell, even the SE70Ms and M2s, which were built as early as 2004 and as late as, let's say, 2005 and 2006, even they were nearing 20 years old when their service life was cut short. And with rising operating costs alongside the lack of spare parts and declining mechanical conditions of many of these locomotives, they can only go for so long before they can finally give up and die. Hence why NS chose to retire most models when they got the chance. Albeit some of them should have been reconsidered before being disposed. 70Ms. It does beg the question as to why NS could have just rebuilt a couple of them. I mean, they've done with the SE60Es and the SE70s, and the -8s, they've already tried that, didn't work, so I can kind of get it. Besides, some railroads would have done away with locomotives that crews likely dreaded to work with. Like, then again, someone in the comments that worked for NS could probably explain like their opinions on these locomotives, I don't know. Number 3, reduce workforce. With the amount of workers getting laid off and the closure of Roanoke, I could only imagine that the existing locomotive shops would be put to hell and back in keeping a more active fleet alive. On top of Altoona being backlogged with DC locomotives, meaning that the repair queues would get full instantly. I can't imagine the deadlines remaining untouched with locomotives waiting for returns to service. That probably wouldn't happen, especially with how NS is persistent with PSR. On top of the reduced amount of crews, that could mean less trains would be needed and most of the locomotives would have just been sitting in storage anyways, waiting to be reprived into active service. And now comes the last factor, which I feel is probably the most important. Number 4, standardization. Let's be real, this is what I feel is undoubtedly a major reason why NS chose to get rid of a majority of its models. Considering that beforehand, Norfolk Southern rostered more than 20 models in active service, and you can only imagine the amount of spare parts and reliability issues that can arise with a varied fleet. While yes, it may be fun to see these varieties on a majority of these trains, consider the operational headache on keeping a varied fleet running with different technologies, reliability issues, cab designs, etc. it only provides more costs on keeping these non-standard and sometimes dated locomotives alive. Sure, you can go for rebuilding them in AC power to standardize them, but then again, Norfolk Southern doesn't give a shit for rebuilding EMDs and would have wanted to find any time to dispose of them. Either way, with the reduced roster, it helps standardize the fleet of locomotives, save on repair costs, and reduce inventory on extra parts for these models. Now, while many locomotives were understandably retired, some I feel didn't deserve to be retired, hence this next segment. Tier list time. So, I'm sure you know how this works, but for this one, I'll rank them based on whether it was worth retiring them or not. The rankings are as follows. A, definitely worth retiring considering the circumstances. B, indifferent on keeping them around, either they could have been utilized somehow or probably would have just been kept running as they were. Or C, no, they weren't worth retiring. Also, the quickly disclaimer, whatever's said in this section is my personal opinion. If you feel like a particular model should have been retired or just kept around, feel free to put your opinions in the comment sections down below. Just, be respectful and rational, alright? Now then, let's begin. Let's start off with the 80 Max. So, I remember hearing that they were high on fuel consumption and the general operating costs made them, pretty redundant. Not to mention, Norfolk Southern wanted to try a rebuild program with them, but I get why the 80 Max were retired, but I'm curious to see how the ACU program would have turned out for them. And speaking of that, yeah, I'm gonna be honest, Norfolk Southern did the ACUs dirty. It's kind of funny how they bought 90 Max and rebuilt them back in 2016, 2017, only for them to just throw them out within 3 to 4 years of them operating. Unlike Canadian Pacific, which was another user of the ACUs, they were also prone to their issues, but at least the company was able to iron them out, whereas Norfolk Southern just looked at them and just said, nope, throw them away. I'm gonna be honest, Norfolk Southern should have just focused on ironing out the issues with them rather than just disposing of them. Dash 8s, definitely worth getting rid of. Norfolk Southern had a bad experience with rebuilding the Dash 8s, and I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want to try the same thing again with the wide cabs. GP59s. Norfolk Southern does have the GP60s, and the GP59s feel a bit non-standard, but did Norfolk Southern also rebuild them? So I'm gonna say B tier. F9As. I kinda get it where they were coming from of getting rid of them. Sure, they may have been upgraded, but at the end of the day, they're still post-war diesel locomotives masquerading as GP38s underneath. A tier, I guess? Y'all are gonna hate me for that, but at least the current owners at least like using them. SD70M-2s. Bro, C tier. Couldn't they have just converted them into AC traction or whatever? Alright, now we have a double whammy. The SC40-2s and the Jeeps. I'm kind of on the fence about this, considering the fact that Norfolk Southern would probably need that much local power, but at the same time, depending on the mechanical status of some of the retired units, I kinda get it. Then again, Norfolk Southern could have just gutted some of those out for spare parts or whatever, instead of just disposing of them, so I'm kind of gonna be honest with B tier. MP15Es. Which Class 1 railroad gives a shit about end-cap switchers now? A tier. ST70s. You know my answer on this, C tier. The fact that Norfolk Southern was doing a rebuild program before PSR, came into effect, really tells you a lot about how I feel. And last but not least, the SC60s. Yeah, C tier. They should have continued rebuilding them in SC60Es. And there you go. With a majority of the locomotive roster wiped away, Norfolk Southern's roster did become more standardized with a reduced amount of active models. While this decision did benefit Norfolk Southern from an operating and financial perspective, there is one factor to consider: power shortages. This tends to happen when freight traffic increases and the railroad's rosters can't supply enough locomotives, often leading to them borrowing other locomotives from other railroads, which especially was the case for Norfolk Southern during the 2020s, hence the higher presence of foreign power during this time. Now, Norfolk Southern did allegedly state that 402 locomotives were kept around as a surge fleet, which is a set of locomotives that only would return to service in case of a rise of traffic. But I'm willing to bet that this was a majority of Dash 9s that were rebuilt in the C6Ms. So yeah, Norfolk Southern did put themselves in a bit of a dilemma. Now, one thing I'd like to note is that the roster standardization did have a few outliers. The specific examples I'm referring to are the 3 SW1001s as shop switchers and the 6 SC45-2s. One of them, as we know, is repainted into the eerie Lackawanna colors. Now, I'm just gonna ask this, but how in the fuck? How did we lose SD70s, which were built 30 years later than these locomotives, and yet 6 of them were only rostered and are somehow still in active service? Like, what kind of fucking logic is this? Like, okay, the SW switchers I kinda get considering the fact they're shop switchers, but the SC45-2s, like, could you just use SC40s instead? And this can't be because, oh, one of them got into heritage colors. There has to be some reason. Was it because they were similar enough to an SC40-2 from a mechanical standpoint? Who knows? Someone at NS would probably know this, so... Anyways, sorry about my little tangent. Now, Norfolk Southern to an extent tried to fix its roster dilemma. Keyword attempted. First, we have the return of a few SC70M-2s in 2023. That's right, they all weren't gone, as it seems like 48 units were kept around as potential surge locomotives. And thankfully, a majority of them did return to service across the NS system, with 2 being rebuilt into AC units and reclassified as SC70I CCs. And it's fair to say you can still see the SC70M-2s in active road service. Is what I would have said if it weren't for the fact that all of them are currently listed as stored on NS-9. Oh my god, that is such a fucking letdown. Wow. Then we had a few leasers, in the form of a few BNSF SC70 Max from Wells Fargo being leased out. Albeit, they were all gone by 2024. However, Norfolk Southern did purchase locomotives of their own, in the form of a few CEFX AC44s and a couple of GCX-9s, only for them to be rebuilt in the C6Ms, and we lost the 2 painted in CMQ colors. So, yay! More AC slop! And aside from that, nothing else. Norfolk Southern's roster is still suffering from the PSR hellhole, and with how the company's been in recent years, who's to say that the current fleet is already being pushed to their limits? I mean, Norfolk Southern's complaining about power shortages, and yet you still see locomotives stored in deadlines in like Altoona. Then again, those could be in there for rebuild queues, so I don't know. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens when the correct monopoly occurs. And if you want my opinions on that, yeah, I hope this ends up like SPSF, please. Now that we covered all of that, you might be wondering where some of these purged locomotives ended up. Well, a majority of these were sold off the progress rail, either to be stripped for parts, rot away, be resold, or in the worst case, scrapped. But thanks to the mass purge though, it did give multiple railroads a chance to get new locomotives to their rosters, with some companies including R.J. Corman, Indiana Railroad, Ontario Northland, Reading Blue Mountain and Northern, Chicago Fort Wayne and Eastern, Aberdeen Caroline and Western, Cater Perrott Railnet, Ferromex, New Brunswick Southern, New York Susquehanna, they should have bought back the SC70Ms, Carload Express, Web Asset Management, and Jiangxing International? What? Okay. Allegedly, a few Norfolk Southern SC60Is were sold to a company in China called Jiangxing International, according to this Facebook post. Considering that there is no further evidence of these locomotives ending up in said country, let alone any documented proof of them in active service, I highly believe this is fake, so take this with a grain of salt. There are a handful of other companies I forgot to mention, but if you know any ex-Norfolk Southern locomotives on other railroads, feel free to comment them below. Aside from that, any other Norfolk Southern locomotives that weren't sold to a leasing company or railroad have more than likely been scrapped. Sadly, amongst these casualties were the SD80 Max, as all of them were scrapped, rendering this iconic locomotive model extinct. Unless you count the bare-bone remains that's sitting somewhere in the Canadian Pacific. So, Norfolk Southern's purge of 2020 was quite a tough decision by the railroad. Now, I get it. The company has to standardize the locomotive fleet. But you can't deny that some models didn't deserve to get retired and that Norfolk Southern did have some good footing with its rebuilding programs. Ultimately, this came at the cost of many locomotives being thrown away, all for the sake of getting more money to satisfy the shareholders that meet right off of Wall Street, because fuck making the railroad any more safer, right? Who cares if they reduce safety standards or park trains on the side of a fucking mountain? Just so long as the shareholders get more money, then nobody higher up cares. This is Norfolk Southern. They totally care for their employees and their people. Okay, sorry, I got carried away. Anyways, regardless of the power purge, it's proven to have its pros and cons, such as locomotives getting new homes while at the same time, Norfolk Southern continues to struggle from never-ending power shortages, and some locomotive models getting lost to time. This indecisive decision ultimately led to the stagnant roster change in 21st century railroading. And while not the first example, it's one of the examples of a decision that killed the spirit of Norfolk Southern, a once glorious Class 1 railroad.
Norfolk Southern, what's your function? Hooking up the country, helping business run. Norfolk Southern, how's that function? Helping this big country move ahead as one.
Hello everyone, this is Callium Productions here. I honestly hope you enjoyed that new video because it took me weeks to make, alongside, well, you know, college and whatnot. This has been another remaster of an old video I made 3 years ago, with much better takes and slight critiques and whatever, and I think I'm actually satisfied with how this turned out. And this has been an idea at the start of the year to talk a bit more in depth about Norfolk Southern's roster purges and whatnot, at the cost of me losing the original script and having to redo it again. Nonetheless, I do want to wish all of you guys a happy new year, and I will see you all in 2026, where I'm hopefully going to continue making more, you know, amateur train slop brainwash, whatever. Anyways, this is me, Kelly Productions, signing off, and I will see you all in 2026.